Thank you so much, Frida, and thank you all for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to be here. As you might imagine, I have a wealth of fondness and respect for Rotary, and it's also my first time at the Adelaide Oval. Would you believe it? I've never actually been inside here, so it's a real pleasure. I thought I would start today by talking a little bit about the circumstances that led me to take up a Rotary Exchange. When I was 17 years old, I was attending Heathwood High School in the Adelaide Hills, and I was at the precipice, I think, that many teenagers find themselves in terms of deciding what it is you want to do with your life and making university applications and putting plans in place to follow a career or an ambition. My problem was a few months into my Year 12 studies was that I had no idea what it was I wanted to do. When I was 6 years old, my parents tell me this, I apparently marched down the corridor of our house, went into the kitchen and said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a writer. And then I produced the first story I'd ever written, which was about a fish whose family was sadly murdered by a fish and chip shop, and he sought revenge by disrupting the fishing industry by placing old boots on their lines until they went out of business. And I had held on to that dream for most of my childhood. I was someone who loved poetry. When I went to the Royal Adelaide Show, I'd always get the stationery show bag, much to my sister's astonishment and confusion. No chocolate in that one. And it was always whenever someone asked me what it was I wanted to be, I would say, I want to be a writer. I want to be a storyteller. I want to create books. I was a huge reader. Some of my earliest memories of reading was lying in the back seat of my parents' car, snatching a sentence at night every time we went under a street light. These were things that I knew I loved from a very early age, and I think that was an incredible gift. My parents were always very supportive of this ambition, but they were also incredibly practical people, and I think they might have been slightly concerned about how I would support myself as an adult. Because whenever I would come out to them with all these desires and books I wanted to write and presenting poetry and say, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to be this person when I grow up, they would say, that's fantastic. You should absolutely do that. But keep in mind that writers are often writers and something else. And maybe you should always think of something else that you could always do. And so I did. So whenever someone asked me what I wanted to be, it was a writer and a doctor, or a writer and a bricklayer. The something else would always change. The bricklaying is true, actually. I thought it was just mud pies. But the writing stayed fast until I got to 17, when writing seemed to me to be something that was more and more going to be a hobby in my life. It was going to be consigned to the periphery, and the emphasis became very much what this something else needed to be. The something else that I needed to study to become an independent adult, to have a career that was widely accepted and approved by society, that was understood, that would give me financial independence and security. This something else, I had no idea what it was I wanted to do. And I remember sitting at an assembly in high school around this time, and the counsellor was reading out all the local opportunities. And she said, oh yes, and the local Stirling Rotary Club is also accepting applicants for 12-month exchanges overseas if anyone wants to come to me for forms. And it felt like I'd been prodded in the back. Immediately I knew this is what I want. I knew I wanted an exchange overseas because I wanted to travel. I hadn't really travelled at all, really, as a kid. And I also knew that a 12 months overseas would give me a grace period in which I could decide what it was to do with my life. So I applied, and I was told quite early on that I wouldn't be able to select where I went as an exchange student. It didn't matter because I didn't really know where I wanted to go. Anywhere would have been fine. And I remember getting in one of the last stages of the panels and the application process and being told that because I hadn't studied any languages, all the countries like France, Germany, Belgium were out for me. Instead, they were going to select something based on personality. All right, let me go through here. Hang on one second. And shortly after that, they asked me the question, how would you cope if you were sent somewhere where it was dark 20 hours a day in winter? And I probably responded with a tad more enthusiasm than they were expecting. I remember thinking, that would be incredible. I would love to experience something like that. And I swear the Rotarian picked up his pen and did a big X next to my name, because before I knew it, I was the only person being sent to Iceland, whereas 5 exchanges went off to America, 5 to Germany, 5 to Spain, and so on. I always assumed I would be sent to Reykjavik. This was 2003 and the internet was not what it was today. But when I was told I was going to be sent to a small town called Söderkróka, I couldn't even find it on a map. I couldn't find it online. I knew nothing of Iceland except the music of Björk, which I did enjoy, and a lot about cod after my aunt kindly tore out 3 pages from her Gourmet Traveller magazine. Said, this is about Icelandic cod. And I said, great, between Björk and cod, I've got a basis to, embrace for the impact of this culture. But of course, I could never have prepared myself for just how different Iceland would be to a little kid from Australia. I landed in January. It was incredibly dark. I was actually forgotten at the airport. I had stopped in Amsterdam on my way through and had seen an exchange student be embraced by their host family with posters and with a huge sign and with hugs and balloons, and I thought, this is going to be amazing. I can't wait to arrive in Iceland. And then I got there at around midnight, and everyone was looking at me because I was wearing those Rotary blazers with all the badges. I felt a little bit like a Christmas tree, and no one came. And I thought, well, Matt, that's okay. I mean, I don't know anything about Iceland. Maybe they have terrible traffic. Maybe it's very busy out there. I'll wait for the next flight. Maybe they think I'm on that one. And still no one came. And eventually I thought, well, look, I've got a number to call, the head of the exchange program in Iceland. I'll ring it. I went to a car hire desk. The man gave me some coins, which all had pictures of fish on them. I went to a phone box. I dialed the number, and I heard this beautiful stream of Icelandic. And then she hung up on me. So I dialed the number again. And this time I stopped and I listened instead of trying to interrupt and saying, oh, I'm an exchange student. My name's Hanna. And then I realized that it was the Icelandic equivalent of, your call could not be connected. So I found a corner of the airport and I sat down. And before too long, I saw someone running towards me. I thought, well, finally, someone's come to get me. It was a security guard. You have to go. The airport's about to close. You have to get on the bus outside. And I was like, but the bus where? No, I have to be picked up. She's like, no, the airport is closing. You can't stay here. Just get on the bus. And I said, well, what am I going to do about the person who's supposed to be picking me up? And she's like, what's his name? I gave her the name. And she's like, get on the bus at this stage, because it had started to drive off. And so I found myself on a bus going to somewhere I had no idea where. And at 2 a.m. I arrived at the last stop that the bus went to, and the driver told me to get off at the depot, I realized. And there was a man in a dressing gown in the empty parking lot saying, "Välkommen till Island, Hanna." The security guard had found him. But this was sort of my fairly inauspicious arrival to a country that culturally and linguistically was incredibly different from what I had experienced. I had quite a difficult start to my exchange. My first host family were incredibly quiet. They didn't really speak to me, and they didn't really speak to each other. And as I mentioned, January, I spent a lot of time necessarily needing to be in this house of silence with them. The wind was incredible in January in this small, tiny fishing village on a North Fjord in Iceland. The darkness compounded the homesickness that I began to feel from being away from my family for this amount of time. And I found myself in a very curious position of not understanding the conversations that were going on around me. Icelandic is an incredibly complex language. It's essentially been bogged down from the 12th century onwards and retains a lot of inflections of Old Norse. And whilst I originally thought that learning a language would be to swap one word out for another, I remember going up to my host dad and saying, what's the Icelandic word for horse? And he said, well, it depends on what context you are going to use it for. And I said, what do you mean? He said, it could be hests, hestins, hestana, hestanna, hestanum, hestum, and so on. And he listed about 12 different variations. But I realized quite soon that not having the language did two things. One, in my isolation, it sent me back to writing. It sent me back to that place of comfort and solace and creativity that I had had all my life. And I found myself writing poetry and stories and embracing books again, finding escape in books and novels. And the other thing it did was make me appreciate that language is so much more than communication. Culture is held in language. A people are held in language. Language is tied to place. And I decided that if I needed to escape the silence of this house and make friends at the high school I had started attending, if I wanted to spend the rest of this year actually belonging to community, I would need to learn the language. And the more I acquired Icelandic words, the more and phrases and proverbs and sayings, the more I actually started to understand the Icelanders. And the more I realized again how important language is, how important it is to be able to express yourself, and what power is held in language and in story. And this continued to motivate me to the point where I found myself trying to write in Icelandic. The other thing that changed was the more I understood Icelandic, the more I realized that I had somehow landed up in a country that was made for writers. Iceland, I think, publishes more books per capita than anywhere else in the world. People read more than anywhere else in the world. People revere writers and poets. There is a very long tradition of poets having a very, very prominent place in the social hierarchy. And this started to come through to me in both indirect and direct ways. And I'll give you an example. I remember once I was sitting in my Icelandic class, and I had to do separate exercises because I wasn't as fluent. And I was incredibly bored. And so I was writing poems in the margins of my books. And my Icelandic teacher at the high school was an incredibly imposing man. He had a very deep voice. He never smiled. He regularly sort of just grumbled as he walked around the place. And I heard him clear his throat above my desk. And I looked up. I was like, "What are you doing that's so much more important than doing your exercises?" And before I had a chance to respond, he picked up my book and he read it and said, "Poetry." And I said, "I'm so sorry. Yes, I'll get back to work. I was a diligent kid normally." And he just kind of made his grumbling noises and went back to his desk. And the next time I rocked up at his classroom, he said, "Hanna," and beckoned me forward. I thought I was going to be told off again. But instead, when I arrived at his desk, he said, "I've got something for you." And he gave me a book. And it looked down and it said, "Icelandic Poetries, a Book of Nature in Translation." And I opened it up, and on the front cover, on the front inscription, he had said, "To Hanna, from one poet to another, Geirlaugur." And from that point onwards, he let me write all the poetry I wanted in his classes. And I think this is one example of many other things that happened to me that meant that by the time I was halfway through my exchange, I thought, you know what, writing is valid and writing is powerful, and it should be something that I prioritize. Maybe I will need something else later, but I'm young, I don't have responsibilities, and being in this Icelandic culture has taught me just how crucial it is to honor that calling within myself. And I applied for a degree in creative writing at Flinders University. So not only did going to Iceland as an exchange student, as a would-be writer who was suffering from severe self-doubt, give me the validation I needed to take those steps into the career that I truly wanted to do, it also gave me the story that would launch that career. A few months, early months into my exchange with this quiet family, and I should say too, I ended up staying with 2 other host families, and the second one especially was incredible and also incredibly encouraging of my writing. But when I was with that first host family, we were driving down to Reykjavik one day. It was still very dark. There was a lot of snow around. And I remember we passed through this extraordinary tract of landscape. It was a valley mouth covered in all these small hundreds of hills. And I was so confused by them. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was such an extraordinary geological feature that I said, guessing, are these Viking burial mounds? And they said, no. They talked amongst themselves in Icelandic. No, I think they were caused by a snowfall. Oh yes, an avalanche. And then I said, oh okay, and just sat back down. They said, no, but it's actually interesting you mentioned this place because you see over there, And they pointed to 3 small hills which sat just beside the road. They said, in the middle of a sheep paddock. They said, that was where they killed the last person in Iceland. That was their last execution. And I was immediately fascinated, as I think anyone would be. I said, oh my gosh, what did he do? And they said, no, it was a woman. It was a woman called Agnes Magnusdottir. They cut off her head with an axe hundreds of years ago because she murdered the man that she worked for. And my next question was, why did she murder him? And they couldn't really answer me. They said, oh, she was a bad person, and left it at that. And there was something, I think, at that time in my exchange where I was still dealing with these feelings of homesickness or feeling like an outsider in a community, where in a place where there were so few people, everyone would stare at me as I walked to school and mutter amongst themselves, sort of saying, oh yeah, that's the exchange student. Where's she from? Oh, she's from Australia, without actually addressing me. So I think this combination of isolation and feeling very conspicuous made me respond to this story in a way that kind of meant that I was haunted by this woman. And in fact, when I had finished my creative writing degree in Adelaide, I thought, you know what, I miss Iceland so much now. I really miss the landscape. I really miss the people. I want to write myself back there. And I immediately thought too of Agnes. Thought there's surely so much more to her story. There's surely so much more which could be said about her. Not necessarily to say that she was innocent, but just to explore her humanity and the times in which she lived. And I threw myself into researching her life. I threw myself into researching the circumstances under which she arrived at that farm in the very northern part of Iceland, a very isolated place called Illugastaðir. And I was swept away by her story and by what I found. I went back to Iceland to conduct 6 weeks of intensive research. And on my first day back, as buzzed as I was with jet lag, I found myself standing in the National Museum in front of the axe and block which killed her. And this was the moment, I think, where the story ceased to become a story, where the history stopped being something that I had either heard about or read about on paper and became for me something very real. And I think that ethical regard in terms of how we write about the dead stayed with me from that moment onwards. And it led me to do even more research to make sure that if I was writing about Icelandic culture and history, I needed to get everything right and to pour my soul and my heart into this book, which I did. Burial Rites is the story of Agnes Magnusdottir. It's fiction. It came out in 2013, a neat 10 years after I first went to Iceland on an exchange. I initially wrote it as part of a PhD, which I never submitted, so please don't call me doctor. But I had anticipated that it would maybe only be read by my mother and examiners. I couldn't have been further from the truth. The book was sold into over 35 different countries. It led to an international auction. Jennifer Lawrence wanted to make a film about it, and it was also translated into Icelandic, which was a particularly beautiful moment for me, and I was able to be there when it was launched. Not only did writing Burial Rites lead to a contract for my second and third book, it also shaped, I think, the kind of stories I wanted to write about as a writer. During my time in Iceland as an exchange student, I heard many stories, and many of them embraced what we would probably consider the supernatural, but they also had a very deep focus on what I would say are intrinsically Icelandic qualities. Intrinsic qualities to the culture, which are resilience, a desire for independence, an incredible warmth under what some people deem a cold exterior. And I feel like these qualities have not only gone on to shape my work and my interests in my novels, but I think it's also gone to shape me. There are many things that I remember particularly about my second host family, whom I'm still in touch with, which influenced the way I even parent my children today. You can see in the first photo up there, that man is Pétur Björnsson, and his wife is Regina Gunnarsdottir. He was my Rotary counsellor, and when I last was in Iceland, I was talking to Pétur about my exchange. It had been 20 years since we'd first met. And I said, your family really changed things for me. That's when things looked up. That's when I really felt I belonged to this place. And he said to me, we were never supposed to be your host family. And I said, what? I'd never known this all 20 years since I'd gone. He said, no, but I could see that you were a really creative kid and you were really homesick. And I went home to my wife and I said, we got to get her out of that house. They had 4 kids under 10 at the time, including a 1-year-old. And Regina, without even missing a beat, said, bring her here. And that's how it happened. And I ended up also going back to them for Christmas before I left. Pieter and Regina came to my wedding in 2019. They now have 6 kids and many, many grandchildren who I am all in touch with. And you can see that's a photo of me and Pieter when I went back to Iceland most recently in 2023. And shortly after that visit, I wrote another book, Always Home, Always Homesick, which was inspired during COVID, during the lockdown, when I found myself, even the idea that I could not return back to Iceland if I wanted to, it brought up this incredible sort of incredibly complex emotions about what it is to have a home, what it is to have multiple homes, and what it means to find belonging in a place on the other side of the world. And this book has then led me to have other opportunities as a writer. It's led me to go around the country and overseas talking about these things. And in the process, I have met many, many, many other exchange students at signings afterwards who say to me, my exchange changed my life too. My exchange gave me my career. My exchange gave me family that I never anticipated having. I met one woman who was 80 years old, and she had done not necessarily the Rotary Exchange, but she'd done actually a similar exchange program. And she said, I didn't go back for over 40 years, and then I did, and they were still there, and it was like not a day had passed. So I cannot underestimate, and I cannot understate, or overstate, I should say. I cannot overstate just how extraordinary that experience has been to me. It is the singular year. It is the hinge upon which I think my career, but certainly my outlook on the world and the person that I have become today rests on. So thank you very, very much for having me. It's been a real privilege to speak to you.
Thank you, Hanna. Fascinating story. Question? David.
Thank you.
Immensely. There seems to be a lot of accent, if you like, or storytelling that you really see a cult and the afterlife, certainly in devotion. Is that something that we've all been interested in? Or is it something that we've unearthed?
Thank you. That's such a good question. I think it was something that for many years I actually did think was something to do with me. And then I'm trying to avoid okay. And then it was actually in the course of writing the questions that led me to write Always Home, Always Homesick, my memoir, which is really an examination of what I've been speaking to today, the ways in which Iceland have shaped me as a person, shaped me as a writer, that made me realize that these are not original thoughts at all, that this is a storytelling tradition that I first became acquainted with as an exchange student. And it was a discovery which I think has heightened my regard for Iceland and my appreciation of just how deeply I have been changed by that experience, on a creative level too. Iceland is a country which is rich in ghosts. It's rich in words that we do not even have in English. Words like draumakona, which is to be a woman of dreams, someone who has prophetic or real dreams. It's full of words like farseti, meaning far-seeing. And even outside of the stories that I encountered when I was an exchange student, I met many people who had these abilities. And often it took for us to establish a relationship before I heard of what I would consider, superstitious abilities or supernatural abilities or psychic abilities. No, it was just part and parcel of life in Iceland. And I've heard it described by Icelanders that Iceland itself is a place where the membrane is very thin between our world and maybe other worlds or the spirit realm. And I think that this is something that, like I say, undoubtedly has gone on to inform the books I write. I think my debt of gratitude to Iceland is far bigger than I'm even aware of.
Thank you very much, Hanna. It was wonderful. This is more a comment than a question. My late wife was Canadian, but her mother was born in Iceland and came to Canada when she was 20. So about 20 years ago, when you were actually in Iceland, she went with her two sisters to Iceland. I was unfortunately too busy working in the Philippines. I didn't go, but I wish I had. But it was her stories and that way that trip impacted on her was unbelievable. And she went to genealogy offices. There were quite a few around the country, and she found that her relatives dated back to a Catholic bishop in the 1700s. I don't know how he had kids, but he must have been. But more importantly, the young guy talking to her, she couldn't get over how much he looked like our son. And so he looked it up, and about 4 generations back, there was a link. So all the things you were saying, she came back with those sort of stories. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, Iceland is a place, I think, where the past is not past. Everyone is deeply aware of their interconnection. And I think this is actually one of the reasons why I am so grateful to that second host family, to Pieter, especially for taking me in and making that call. Because I remember quite early on, they had an open house. Kids at all, people would be coming, going all the time. And every time someone came in, even if I'd already met them before, I realized, because by this stage I had learnt Icelandic, me and the 1-year-old had sort of learnt it at the same pace, that he was introducing me to everyone as our Hanna, whereas before it had been, this is the exchange student. And once they had given me a place in their family, I had a place in that kinship network. And people understood then how to relate to me within that sort of familial kind of, deeply kind of, that society that rests so deeply on kinship. So I think that would be an extraordinary thing to go back and to explore that. And no doubt you will find relatives, because people are very, very aware of how they are related to one another and how they are related to historical figures as well.
Yeah, Hanna, Stephen Noble. I'm going to take all the Rotarians in this room back, going into your digging into history a little bit. Hanna's mother grew up in Waikerie. Her grandfather, Eric Irwin, was one of the charter members of Rotary Club of Waikerie, which is still a very robust Rotary Club in this district. And I think we've got our district governor here. He'll attest to that. It's probably one of the few that's really growing. So it's a very vibrant club, and I still have a lot of friends up there. I was going to share with you that we were on a trip last year. We met a lady, Kay Wright, who works in publishing. You might know of her. And we happened to mention our knowledge, and my wife is a voracious reader. I'm a less voracious reader of novels. I don't make the time. But one of the novelists I do read in crime fiction is Jo Nesbø, who hails from Norway. And if anyone hasn't read him, I recommend, if you want some fairly gripping novels. They're pretty graphic. But I was just musing about the comments you made about Iceland. I'm thinking about the Nordic and then Jo Nesbø, and he's published something like 55 million books and always really at the top of the pile in that crime and fiction area. I was wondering if that forced, in a sense, isolation during those long winter months, does that sort of improve or have an impact on creativity? Because I think it's not just unusual. There are other examples.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's not one that I feel I'm in an official place to answer, but from my own observations, I think it has a lot to do with the darkness. So the town that I stayed in, so the Kroka, because of the way it is situated too, behind the mountains. In the north, there are lots of these old glacial valleys. So you have the mountain ranges extending inland to the highlands where you can't live or really go half the time. And because of that, the sun, even though it is slipping over the horizon at some point, doesn't yet reach over the mountains. So while you have increasing light, you don't have direct sunlight. You cannot see the sun. And I think it was really interesting being an exchange student who went from January to January. Every other Rotary Exchange student from Europe who I met during my time went from June to June. But because of that, I got to compare and have two very different winter experiences with exactly that. How do you deal with the darkness? How do you deal with the weather? How do you deal with the confinement indoors? And by the second one, I found myself doing things which I think Icelanders are very good at doing, which is having a lot of hobbies. I was playing volleyball with a bunch of women who were in their 50s. I was painting. I was writing like you wouldn't believe. And I noticed around me that all of my friends were doing similar things. And I know that Iceland is still, I mean, when I was there, I think the total population was 250,000 people. And now it's still under 500,000. And yet they punch way above their weight in regards to, having international fame and recognition for music, for filmmaking, for writing particularly. And I think they take a lot of pride in this. And I do think a lot of that comes from, having to stay inside and having to amuse yourself. There's only so much Netflix you can watch over 8 months of winter.
Hanna, I have a question for you. When a book becomes a film, obviously some of the censors are left out or changed. What is it like for you to let go of the text and trust a new creative team when your books are made into films?
That's a good question. I'm in a fairly unique position at the moment in that I'm writing the adaptations of 2 of my films. So you could argue that I don't let go. But I think, I know some writers get very upset about adaptations, and I do think it's true that an adaptation will never live up to the novel because you can never access an interior life, which is, I think, what novels do so beautifully. You have to convey it, but that's never going to be a feature of its exploration. So for me, I think a successful adaptation is not necessarily a copy of a book. I think it is something that retains the soul of the original creative product, whether it be a play or whether it be a book particularly, but nonetheless explores it in new ways. And for me, writing adaptations of The Good People and Devotion, I think of it, I don't actually return to the book. I don't reread it at all. I just try to hold on to what I remember from it and the feeling that runs through it. But for me, it's an opportunity almost to write them all over again. So that's how I approach it.
Really would like to thank you on our very own 101 knockout. We turned 100 a couple of years ago, and here's 102. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Please stand up and